They say the lighthouse by the sea was not lit just for light, but for a promise, for a secret, buried deep beneath the silent waves. When the first leaves of October began to fall, the little town of Maple Hollow seemed to breathe differently. The air grew cooler, the streets quieter, and the nights longer. There was something in the way the light faded earlier each evening, as though the world was slowly preparing to rest. In a small wooden house at the edge of town, where ivy climbed the windows and wind hummed through the shutters, lived Agnes. Her hair, once chestnut brown, had turned silver like moonlight on water. Her hands trembled gently when she held her teacup, yet there was still a kind of grace in her movements, the quiet rhythm of someone who had lived a long, careful life. It was Halloween again. Children's laughter echoed faintly down the street, distant bells of life she no longer took part in. Every year, she watched them from her window, tiny shapes in the dim glow of street lamps, their costumes bright against the night. She smiled sometimes, though her eyes often softened with something deeper, a sadness too old for tears. For 50 years, Agnes had lit a single jack-o'-lantern every Halloween night. Not for decoration, not for tradition, but for remembrance. Because 50 years ago, on this same night, her little brother Mark disappeared. He had been 6, small and full of light, with cheeks flushed pink from running and eyes that always seemed to sparkle with curiosity. He'd been excited for the Halloween party that night. He'd carved his pumpkin, worn his tiny pirate hat, and carried his handmade trick-or-treat bag with pride. Agnes had helped him sew it herself, stitching little patches onto the fabric, laughing each time the thread tangled. He'd thanked her with a wooden toy soldier, carved from a block of pine, his first handmade gift. She had kept it by her bedside for years. But that night he never came back. One moment he was running across the yard, calling out to his friends. The next there was only silence. No one found him. No one knew what happened. Some said he'd been kidnapped. Others whispered he'd fallen into the lake. But Agnes, she never believed in endings without answers. And so she waited. Every year, she carved a pumpkin and lit a lantern where he vanished. Every year, she whispered his name into the night wind. And every year she hoped that maybe, somehow, he could see the light. Years later, when people walked past the woods at Halloween, they sometimes saw 2 faint lights glowing by the creek. They said an old woman and her brother lived there once. A story of loss and reunion, of time and forgiveness. No one knew for sure. But every Halloween night, the lanterns still flickered in the dark. And somewhere beyond the veil of time, 2 souls sat quietly, together again, surrounded by the endless calm of peace. When dawn came, the mist rolled gently over the cabin. Agnes slept in a chair by the fire, her brother's blanket draped around her shoulders. Mark watched her for a moment, his heart full of both sorrow and peace. He stepped outside carrying the 2 lanterns. He placed them by the stream, their flames flickering side by side. The morning sun touched them, and for a brief moment, it looked as though the light itself bowed in silence. That night, as the stars gathered, Agnes dreamed. She dreamed of her childhood, of laughter, of the lake, of a boy running ahead with a wooden toy in his hand. In her dream, he turned back and smiled. The lanterns still burned, their glow stretching softly across the water, a promise that no light truly dies when it is lit with love. That evening they sat together by the fire. Mark showed her the toys he'd made, each one a memory carved into wood. He told her how he'd always dreamed of finding her again, but fear and shame had kept him in silence. Agnes listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Do you know," she said softly, "I never stopped lighting that lantern. Every Halloween I left it by the oak tree, for you." Mark smiled faintly. "I saw it once, years ago, from the woods. I thought it was just a trick of the light." She reached over, took his hand and whispered, "It was me. It was always me." They sat in silence. Outside, the wind brushed the leaves, and the sound of children laughing drifted faintly through the forest. Mark rose and fetched a small pumpkin from the corner. He carved it slowly, his hand steady despite his age, and placed it beside hers. "2 lanterns now," he said with a smile. It was near dusk when Agnes reached the edge of the woods. The path was overgrown, the air cool and still. A stream murmured somewhere nearby, and the scent of pine drifted through the air. Then she saw it, an old cabin leaning slightly, covered in ivy. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Her footsteps were soft as she approached. Through the window she saw shelves lined with wooden toys. Horses, soldiers, tiny houses, and figures of children, all carved with care. Her breath trembled. She pushed the door gently, creaked open. Inside the fire burned low, and by the table stood an old man, thin and stooped, with eyes like the lake at dusk. He turned slowly. When his gaze met hers, something deep inside both of them seemed to stop. "Agnes," he whispered. The toy fell from her hand. Her lips parted, her voice barely a breath. "Mark." He nodded. His voice shook. "I didn't mean to go. I got scared that night. Ran. I was so small I didn't know the way home. A man found me, the old woodcarver. He took me and raised me. When he passed I stayed. I thought maybe it was too late." Agnes stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. "It's never too late." They stood there for a long time, 2 old souls bound by one night 50 years apart. The next morning, the fog lay thick across Maple Hollow. Agnes, wrapped in her coat, held the toy soldier in her hand as she walked into town. She stopped at the post office, an old brick building that smelled of dust and paper. Behind the counter stood Henry, once a boy who'd played with Mark, now an old man with kind eyes. When she showed him the toy, his expression changed. "I know that carving," he said slowly. "There was a man who used to make toys like this. Lived near Willow Creek. Quiet fella. Kept to himself. Said he had no family." Agnes's fingers tightened around the toy. "Do you remember his name?" Henry frowned, thinking. No one really knew it. Folks just called him the woodcarver. Her heart gave a quiet, painful flutter. The woodcarver. She thanked Henry and left, her mind racing through the fog. Could it be? After all these years? That night, Agnes sat awake by the fireplace, staring at the toy soldier resting on her table. The house was quiet except for the creak of wood and the faint ticking of a clock. The flame's glow brushed across her face. Half shadow, half memory. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she could see it all again, the night he disappeared. Mark running across the porch, laughing. The orange glow of pumpkins lighting the path. The sound of children's voices echoing down the lane. Then the shout. The silence. The lantern falling from her hand. For 50 years she had replayed that moment. 50 years of wondering where he went, what he saw, whether he was afraid. And now, this toy. It couldn't be coincidence. She rose slowly and walked to her shelf. From a small wooden box, she took out old photographs, her and Mark by the lake, their parents smiling, a memory of sunshine and safety. She whispered, "If this is your sign, Mark. If you're still out there, I'll find you." The clock ticked on. The house seemed to sigh, as though the walls themselves remembered her words. That Halloween night, the moon hung pale and thin like a faded coin. The rain had just stopped, leaving the air wet and cool. Agnes wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, picked up her candle and stepped outside. The leaves underfoot were soft and damp. The air smelled of wood smoke and distant candy. She moved slowly toward the old oak tree, the same one that had stood for generations, gnarled and patient, as though it too remembered what she had lost. Her lantern flickered in the breeze as she knelt by the roots. She placed the jack-o'-lantern carefully, lit the candle inside, and watched the small flame dance behind the carved grin. "Happy Halloween, Mark," she whispered. Then something caught her eye, a small, faded shape half buried beneath the leaves. She leaned closer. Her heart stopped. It was a trick-or-treat bag. Faded, but familiar. She reached out with trembling hands, brushing the wet leaves aside. It was his. Had to be his. Inside, she found a handful of brittle leaves. And something wooden. A small toy soldier carved by hand. The same crooked smile, the same little sword made of a twig. For a long time she couldn't move. Her breath came shallow, her mind spinning through decades of silence. Then slowly she pressed the toy to her chest, closed her eyes and began to cry. Not loudly but softly, like the sound of rain on the window. The candle flame beside her flickered, then steadied, as though listening.